In this video, we'll be talking about risk perception. To effectively communicate about risk, you need to understand how people perceive risk. What's the scariest horror movie you've ever seen? Think about it. Why did it scare you? How does the writer or director of a scary movie frighten people? People who are rational and who know they're in a perfectly safe place while watching the movie. And the answer is perception. Perception is reality. For risk communication, it's important to understand perception is reality. People act or fail to act based on their perceptions. People will incorporate new information that's consistent with their perceptions, but they'll reject new information that's inconsistent with their perceptions and their beliefs and their values. It's not irrational to be scared by a horror movie, and the public is not irrational. People's perceptions are often inaccurate, but they're rarely irrational. Irrationality implies that the perceptions and the thoughts are random, illogical, and absurd. That's not what happens with risks. Risk perception and behavior towards risk are predictable and they're manageable. It's easy for experts to think that the lay public have irrational perceptions about risks, and that influences their thoughts about whether they believe the public can reach a right decision. Indeed, they can reach a right decision, but it will depend on your definition of right. Public perceptions are unlikely to match expert perceptions. And so the two groups may have very different views of what the right decision is. We all tend to believe that other people share our values. We tend to believe that they know many of the same things we do, and we tend to believe that others are naturally interested in the same things that we are. As a result, we generally overestimate how representative our knowledge and opinions are of the world and the population and the people around us. We also believe that given the same set of facts, others would come to the same set of conclusions that we do. This belief is strongly held by scientists and experts, and this belief is also socially reinforced. We choose friends with similar values and interests who do think much the same way we do. In part, this is why we enjoy our time with them and our associations with people like this. That tends to reinforce our belief that others feel as we do. We tend to think that everyone does or should think the same way we do. When we find out that everyone doesn't think like we do, the natural tendency is to question the competency or motives of those who do not agree with us. As a result, it's easy for experts to conclude that the public is inconsistent and irrational. Irrationality implies that the public cannot make decisions. What most surveys suggest is that much of the public has not yet made decisions about risks because they haven't been high on their agenda. That means there is time to influence and manage those perceptions. There are several real dangers in believing that the public is irrational when it comes to making decisions about risks. The first is concluding that since the public is irrational, efforts to provide information and education are a waste of time and money. The second is concluding that since the public is irrational, they cannot make good decisions. As such, those who are rational, that would be the experts, should make the decisions. And they'll make decisions that are good for the public. These conclusions are dangerous. The first one nearly ensures that the public will not have the tools needed to make informed decisions. The second one nearly ensures that the public will become angry that decisions about the acceptability of a perceived risk are being made for them. Avoid both of these mistakes. before this course is over, I hope that you will have all read the seminal article that provides a brief history of reaching risk communication goals. All we have to do is get the numbers right. And then we thought, well, we need to tell them the numbers. And then we thought, well, we need to explain what we mean by the numbers. And then we can show them that they've accepted similar risks in the past and show them it's a good deal for them. Then we thought perhaps we need to treat them nice, and finally decided that it might be important to make them partners. It turns out good risk communication requires all of these things. There's been a great deal of risk perception research. One of the seminal articles was by Chauncey Starr, published in the 1969 version of Science. He assumed that society had reached equilibrium in its judgments of risks, meaning that whatever risk levels actually exist in society are, by definition, acceptable. He suggested that people will accept risk 1,000 times greater if they are voluntary risks, for example, driving a car, than if they are involuntary risks, for example, nuclear disaster. You have in front of you a psychometric model of risk perception. There are two risk axes here. There is the unknown risk, and that would apply to risks that are not observable or unknown to those who are exposed to the risks, risks that have delayed effects, new risks, or risks unknown to science. So to the extent that a risk has those characteristics, people will perceive it as higher risk. The factor one, the dread risk, this would include things like whether the risk was controllable or uncontrollable, whether it was global or catastrophic, if the consequences were fatal, is the risk perceived as equitable or not? Is there a high risk to future generations? Can it be easily reduced or not? Is the risk increasing? And is it involuntary? So to the extent that a risk has these characteristics, it would be considered dreaded. So the most highly perceived risks are those that are unknown and high on the dreaded factor as well. Former Rutgers professor Peter Sandman popularized what has been referred to as the outrage model of risk. You know how experts assess risk. They would use the top equation there. Risk is a consequence times a probability. That means how bad it is times how likely it is to happen. And the data and the science and the evidence for this all comprise what we would call hazard. But in a public assessment of risk, the characteristics and social context of the hazard are important. All the other things people will worry about that the experts ignore, we're going to call that outrage. And so we're going to be focusing on that second equation, risk is equal to hazard plus outrage. A key mistake experts sometimes make is focusing on hazard. Don't ignore outrage. Hazard is more than probability and consequence. As Sandman and others have suggested, outrage is as real as hazard, it is as measurable as hazard, it's as manageable as hazard, and it's as much part of risk as hazard. There are two components of public risk perception. There are cognitive components, and these would be our thoughts, how we understand the likelihood and consequences of the hazard, the mental models of how and why the particular hazard poses a threat, and our ability to understand the context surrounding the hazard. The other component, though, would comprise affective components. These would be feelings. And it's not just dread or outrage. It can be fear, worry, frustration, sadness, anger, disgust, protectiveness, and any other emotion that you could imagine. Research shows that while people often experience a variety of emotions related to risks, they rarely panic. This is important to understand. Politicians and others often use fear of panic as a reason to withhold risk information. People may initially become anxious, fearful, or hypervigilant. That's normal and a predictable response. Panic is very, very uncommon. One thing that you want to take care to do, however, is never tell people not to panic. Affect or feelings play an important role in how people judge risk. Paul Slovic and his colleagues suggest that affect can strongly influence decisions. Information conveys positive and negative feelings. Finucane et al. Have identified the affect heuristic, and this basically means people look to their positive and negative feelings as a guide to their evaluation of an activity's risk and benefits. Many psychologists, and especially economists, who incorporate affect into their theories of risk and decisions, believe that affect is the byproduct of cognition. People evaluate the information they are given, and that leads to an overall affective reaction, something like fear, anger, dread, or outrage. However, research suggests that people have a remarkably poor understanding of what influences their perceptions and behaviors. They can't say why they feel the way they do, or why they made a particular choice, or why they act the way they do. Research suggests it seems clear that affect can also drive future cognition. First impressions matter. The curb appeal, that immediate reaction to a situation, is a very real phenomenon. So is cyclical thinking. I like it because it's good, and it's good because I like it. Risk perception is a mix of facts and feelings, intellect and instinct, reason and gut reaction. And in many cases, the feelings, instinct, gut have the greater influence. Risk communication must address each of these influences if it's going to be successful.